My name is Claire, and for 5 years, I was the ghost in the machine at Meridian Technologies, one of Chicago's most prestigious marketing firms. Every morning, I would walk through those gleaming glass doors on Michigan Avenue, my heels clicking against the polished marble floors, carrying my worn leather portfolio filled with ideas that would never see the light of day. The elevator ride to the 14th floor was always the same. I'd stand in the corner while my colleagues discussed weekend plans or the latest campaign they were working on, as if I wasn't even there. When the doors opened, I'd walk past the reception area where Amanda, the front desk coordinator, would offer everyone a warm smile except me. It wasn't personal, I told myself. I was just part of the furniture. My desk was tucked away in what everyone called the corner, a section of the office where natural light barely reached. While the senior marketing executives enjoyed floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Lake Michigan, I worked under fluorescent lights that hummed constantly. The irony wasn't lost on me that someone in charge of creating compelling visual campaigns spent her days in the darkest part of the building. "Claire, can you make 20 copies of this presentation?" Marcus would ask, dropping a stack of papers on my desk without making eye contact. Marcus was the creative director, a title he wore like a badge of honor. He'd joined the company just 2 years ago, straight out of graduate school. Yet somehow he was already leading major accounts while I remained stuck handling administrative tasks. I'd started at Meridian with such high hopes. Fresh out of Northwestern with a degree in marketing and communications, I thought my portfolio would speak for itself. During my interview, I'd presented 3 comprehensive campaign concepts that I'd developed during college. Sarah Mitchell, the VP of Operations, had seemed impressed, nodding appreciatively as I walked through my strategic approach to brand positioning. "We could really use someone with your analytical skills," she'd said, shaking my hand firmly. "Welcome to the Meridian family." But being part of the family, I quickly learned, didn't mean you got a seat at the dinner table. The first year, I told myself it was normal. Everyone starts at the bottom, right? I'd get my chance to prove myself once I understood the company culture better. I volunteered for every project, stayed late to help with presentations, and even came in on weekends to ensure our materials were perfectly polished. When the Global Brands account needed a comprehensive competitive analysis, I spent 3 weeks researching every detail, creating charts and graphs that mapped out market opportunities with precision. The presentation was a success. The client signed a multi-million-dollar contract, and our team was celebrated at the monthly company meeting. I watched from the back of the conference room as Marcus received a standing ovation, accepting praise for the brilliant strategic insights that had won the account. My analysis was never mentioned. "Great work on the research, Claire," Sarah said afterward, patting my shoulder like I was a helpful intern rather than a marketing professional with genuine strategic vision. The second year brought more of the same. I'd submit campaign concepts through the proper channels, only to watch them disappear into the bureaucratic void. Weeks later, I'd see similar ideas presented by other team members, always with just enough changes to avoid plagiarism, but clearly inspired by my original thinking. When I tried to speak up, I was told that collaboration meant building on each other's ideas. "That's how innovation works," Marcus explained during one particularly frustrating team meeting. "We all contribute pieces to the puzzle, except my pieces never seemed to have my name on them." The breaking point came during my 3rd year. TechFlow, a major software company, was looking for a complete rebrand. It was exactly the type of project I'd been preparing for my entire career. I spent months developing a comprehensive strategy that addressed not just their visual identity, but their entire market positioning. I researched their target demographics, analyzed their competitors' messaging, and created a roadmap that would differentiate them in an oversaturated market. I submitted my proposal through the proper channels, attaching detailed mock-ups, budget projections, and timeline estimates. For 2 weeks, I heard nothing. Then, during the Friday afternoon team meeting, Marcus announced that he'd be leading the TechFlow rebrand. "I'm excited to share some innovative concepts I've been developing," he said, clicking through slides that looked remarkably similar to my original proposal. The color schemes were different, the fonts had been changed, but the strategic framework was unmistakably mine. I sat in stunned silence as the room erupted in congratulations. Sarah was practically beaming as she discussed how this project would elevate our firm's reputation in the tech sector. My hands shook slightly as I gripped my coffee cup, trying to process what was happening. After the meeting, I approached Sarah privately. The conversation didn't go as I'd hoped. "Claire, I appreciate your enthusiasm, but project assignments are made based on experience and client relationships," she explained, not even bothering to look up from her phone. "Marcus has been building rapport with the tech sector for months, but the strategic framework is exactly what we need for this project. Thank you for your input during the brainstorming phase." Brainstorming phase. As if my months of work had been casual contribution to a group effort. Years 4 and 5 blurred together in a haze of thankless tasks and missed opportunities. I became the person they called when they needed someone to work weekends, to handle the tedious details that the real marketing professionals didn't want to deal with. I organized files, coordinated meetings, and watched from the sidelines as younger, less experienced colleagues were promoted around me. The worst part wasn't the lack of recognition. It was the gradual erosion of my confidence. I began to question whether my ideas were actually good, whether I'd been deluding myself about my capabilities. Maybe I really was better suited for support roles. Maybe this was as far as I was meant to go. During particularly dark moments, usually late at night when I was still at the office while everyone else had gone home, I'd pull up job search websites. But starting over somewhere else felt overwhelming. What if the next place was the same? What if the problem wasn't the company, but me? So I stayed, becoming increasingly invisible with each passing day. I perfected the art of blending into the background, of making myself useful without being threatening. I became the reliable one, the person who could be counted on to handle whatever task nobody else wanted. But even ghosts have their limits. The announcement came on a Tuesday morning in October. Robert Chen, the founder and CEO of Meridian Technologies, would be visiting our Chicago office for the first time in 3 years. The news sent ripples of excitement and anxiety throughout the entire floor. Suddenly, everyone was concerned about presentation quality, office organization, and making sure their best work was prominently displayed. I watched the preparation frenzy with detached amusement. While my colleagues scrambled to polish their portfolios and practice their elevator pitches, I continued with my usual routine. After 5 years of invisibility, I had no illusions about being noticed during a CEO visit. I'd probably be asked to help set up the conference room or make sure there was enough coffee. "Claire, make sure all the client files are organized alphabetically," Sarah instructed, dropping a stack of folders on my desk. "And can you coordinate the catering for Mr. Chen's lunch meeting?" Of course. Even during the most important visit in years, I was handling logistics while others prepared to showcase their creative achievements. The day of the visit, I arrived early to ensure everything was perfect. The conference room was spotless, the catering was arranged precisely as requested, and all the necessary materials were organized and easily accessible. I'd even prepared backup copies of every presentation, knowing how these high-stakes meetings could go wrong over technical difficulties. Robert Chen arrived at exactly 10 a.m., accompanied by 2 assistants and the unmistakable aura of someone accustomed to command. He was younger than I'd expected, probably in his early 40s, with sharp eyes that seemed to take in every detail. Sarah and Marcus flanked him immediately, eager to begin the tour of our innovative workspace. I retreated to my corner desk, focusing on routine tasks while the entourage moved through the office. Occasionally, I could hear fragments of conversation as they discussed ongoing projects and strategic initiatives. Sarah's voice carried particularly well as she highlighted the successful campaigns our team had executed over the past year. Around noon, they settled into the main conference room for presentations. Through the glass walls, I could see Marcus presenting the TechFlow rebrand, gesturing enthusiastically at slides that featured my strategic framework. Sarah nodded approvingly while Robert Chen listened with professional attention. I tried to focus on my work, but it was impossible to ignore the meeting happening just 20 feet away. Every few minutes, laughter would escape from the conference room, indicating that things were going well. Marcus was in his element, commanding attention and receiving the kind of recognition I'd been craving for years. Then something unexpected happened. During what appeared to be a brief break in the presentations, Robert Chen stood up and walked to the conference room window. He seemed to be surveying the office space, his gaze moving methodically from section to section. When his eyes reached my corner, something made him pause. I was working on a quarterly report, surrounded by organized stacks of research data and competitor analyses. My desk, unlike most others in the office, was meticulously organized with clearly labeled folders and color-coded filing systems. Years of handling everyone else's projects had taught me the value of systematic organization. To my complete surprise, Robert Chen left the conference room and walked directly toward my desk. "Excuse me," he said, his voice carrying a slight accent that suggested international background. "I'm Robert Chen." I looked up, momentarily speechless. Hello. I'm Claire Morrison." He extended his hand and I shook it, acutely aware that every eye in the office was now focused on our interaction. Sarah and Marcus had followed him out of the conference room, their expressions mixing curiosity with barely concealed concern. "I couldn't help but notice your workspace," Robert continued, gesturing at my desk. "It's remarkably well organized. Are you working on anything interesting?" The question caught me completely off guard. When was the last time anyone had asked about my work with genuine interest? I glanced nervously at Sarah, who was making subtle gestures that I interpreted as, "Keep it brief and professional." "Just quarterly analysis reports," I said, downplaying the comprehensive market research I'd been compiling. "Nothing too exciting." Robert Chen smiled slightly. "May I take a look?" Before I could respond, he was already scanning the documents on my desk. His expression grew more focused as he examined my competitor analysis charts and market positioning graphs. I'd been working on this particular project for weeks, analyzing industry trends and identifying potential opportunities for our clients. "This is excellent work," he said, picking up a detailed report I'd prepared on emerging social media platforms and their potential impact on traditional marketing strategies. "Who commissioned this analysis?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Sarah stepped forward quickly. "Claire handles a lot of our background research," she explained, her tone suggesting that this was merely supportive work rather than independent strategic thinking. But Robert Chen was still studying my documents with obvious interest. "This isn't just research," he said, looking directly at me. "This is strategic analysis. You've identified market gaps that I haven't seen addressed anywhere else in the industry." My heart started beating faster. "Thank you. I try to look beyond the obvious trends." "Walk me through this section," he said, pointing to a chart that mapped social media influence patterns across different demographic groups. "How did you develop this framework?" For the next 15 minutes, I found myself explaining my analytical approach to the CEO of the company, while my colleagues watched in stunned silence. Robert Chen asked insightful questions that demonstrated he understood not just the surface-level implications of my work, but the deeper strategic thinking behind it. "Have you presented this analysis to any clients?" he asked. "No," I admitted. "This was just for internal reference." "Internal reference?" His eyebrows raised slightly. "This is exactly the kind of innovative thinking our clients are paying for." Sarah cleared her throat diplomatically. "Claire does excellent support work for our client-facing teams." Support work. The phrase stung, but Robert Chen's reaction suggested he saw something different. "How long have you been with the company?" he asked me directly. 5 years. "And what's your educational background?" "Northwestern, marketing, and communications. I also completed additional certification programs in digital analytics and consumer behavior psychology." He nodded thoughtfully, then did something that changed everything. "I'd like you to join us for the afternoon strategy session," he announced. "Bring these analyses. I think our leadership team needs to see this work." The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah's smile looked frozen in place, while Marcus appeared to be processing what had just happened. Around the office, conversations had stopped as people tried to understand why the CEO was inviting the corner desk girl to a high-level strategy meeting. "I'm not sure that's necessary," Sarah began. I'm sure it is, Robert Chen interrupted gently but firmly. Fresh perspectives are exactly what we need. As I gathered my materials with trembling hands, I caught a glimpse of my reflection in the darkened computer screen. For the first time in 5 years, I looked like someone who belonged in that conference room. The afternoon session would prove to be unlike anything I'd ever experienced at Meridian Technologies. Walking into that conference room felt like entering a different world. For 5 years, I'd only seen this space from the outside, watching through glass walls as important decisions were made without me. Now I was sitting at the polished conference table, my research spread out before me while the company's senior leadership waited to hear what I had to say. Robert Chen took his seat at the head of the table, flanked by Sarah and Marcus, along with 3 other executives I recognized but had never formally met. David Palmer, VP of Client Relations, Jennifer Walsh, Director of Strategic Partnerships, and Thomas Reed, Head of Creative Development. These were the people who shaped the direction of our company, and suddenly I was expected to contribute to their conversation. Before we continue with the scheduled presentations, Robert began, I'd like Claire to share some analysis she's been working on. I think it's particularly relevant to our discussion about emerging market opportunities. All eyes turned to me. The silence felt heavy, expectant. Sarah's expression was carefully neutral, while Marcus looked like he was trying to solve a complex puzzle. I took a deep breath and reminded myself that I'd been preparing for this moment my entire career, even if I'd never imagined it would happen like this. Over the past several months, I've been tracking shifts in consumer behavior across different platforms, I began, my voice steadier than I'd expected. What I've discovered is that traditional demographic targeting is becoming increasingly ineffective. I pulled up my first chart, a complex mapping of social media engagement patterns that I'd developed by analyzing data from multiple sources. Most marketing strategies still rely on age-based demographics, but influence patterns are actually clustering around lifestyle choices and value systems that transcend generational boundaries. Robert Chen leaned forward slightly, his attention completely focused. Can you give us a specific example? This was exactly the kind of question I'd hoped for. Take sustainable products, I continued, feeling my confidence grow. The conventional wisdom says that younger consumers drive eco-friendly purchasing decisions, but my analysis shows that influence actually originates from high-engagement micro-communities that span multiple age groups, then spreads through network effects rather than demographic categories. I showed them a visualization I'd created that mapped these influence patterns like a complex web. Different colors represented different community types, and the connections between them revealed how ideas and preferences actually spread through social networks. This is fascinating, Jennifer Walsh said, studying the chart closely. How does this translate into practical campaign strategy? Instead of targeting demographics, we should be identifying and engaging with these influence nodes, I explained. A campaign that starts with the right micro-community can achieve broader reach with much lower investment than traditional mass market approaches. The room was completely silent except for the soft scratching of pens as people took notes. I'd dreamed of moments like this, when my ideas would be taken seriously and evaluated on their merits rather than dismissed as support work. Do you have case studies? Thomas Reed asked. I nodded, pulling out another section of my analysis. I've been tracking 3 different product launches over the past 6 months, comparing traditional campaigns with this network-based approach. The results are significant. The data was compelling. Companies that had inadvertently stumbled onto influence node strategies had achieved up to 400% better engagement rates, while spending 60% less on advertising. I'd identified the patterns they'd followed and developed a framework for intentionally replicating their success. Claire, Robert Chen said, his voice carrying a tone I'd never heard directed at me before. This isn't just research. This is groundbreaking strategic thinking. The words hit me like a physical sensation. Groundbreaking. Strategic thinking. These were terms I'd only heard applied to the work of senior executives and celebrated creative directors. Hearing them used to describe my analysis felt surreal. Have you tested this framework with any of our current clients? David Palmer asked. Not officially, I admitted, but I've been applying elements of it to some of the background research I do, and the preliminary results are encouraging. Sarah finally spoke up. Claire has been very helpful with research support across multiple projects. But Robert Chen wasn't satisfied with that characterization. This goes far beyond support work, he said firmly. This is innovative strategic development that could transform how we approach client campaigns. He turned to address the entire room. This is exactly what I was hoping to find during this visit. We've been discussing the need for fresh approaches to reach evolving markets, and Claire has developed a framework that addresses those challenges head-on. The next hour passed in a blur of detailed questions, strategic discussions, and collaborative brainstorming. For the first time in my career at Meridian, I wasn't just answering questions about logistics or providing data for other people's presentations. I was actively shaping the conversation, contributing ideas that were being seriously considered and built upon by the leadership team. Marcus tried several times to redirect the conversation toward his own projects, but Robert Chen kept returning to my analysis and its implications for the company's future direction. When Sarah attempted to frame my work as a team effort, he politely but clearly credited me as the primary researcher and strategic thinker behind the insights. I'd like to see this framework developed into a comprehensive methodology, Robert Chen announced as the meeting began to wind down. Claire, how long would you need to create a full presentation that we could share with our top-tier clients? My mind raced. A full presentation meant developing materials that would represent the company at the highest level. It meant having my name attached to strategic recommendations that could influence million-dollar campaigns. 2 weeks, I said, hoping I sounded more confident than I felt. I'd need to expand the case studies and develop implementation guidelines, but I can have a complete framework ready in 2 weeks. Excellent. He made a note on his tablet. I'd also like you to present this at our Global Strategy Summit next month in New York. The Global Strategy Summit. I'd heard about this annual gathering of Meridian's international leadership team, but I'd never imagined attending, let alone presenting. It was the kind of opportunity that defined careers. That sounds wonderful, Sarah interjected quickly. I'm sure Marcus and I can help Claire prepare appropriate materials for such an important audience. Robert Chen's response was polite but definitive. I appreciate the offer, but I think Claire should take the lead on this. Her insights deserve to be presented in her own voice. As the meeting concluded, people began gathering their materials and making small talk about next steps. I sat for a moment, trying to process what had just happened. In the span of one afternoon, I'd gone from invisible support staff to key presenter at the company's most important annual event. David Palmer approached me as others were leaving. Claire, I've been watching some of the research you've done for various projects over the years. This presentation today helps me understand what I was seeing. You've been developing sophisticated strategic thinking, while the rest of us were focused on day-to-day execution. His words carried an undertone of regret, as if he was recognizing something that should have been obvious earlier. I look forward to working with you more directly on upcoming campaigns. As I packed up my materials, Robert Chen stopped by my chair. Claire, I want you to know that what happened today isn't a fluke. You've clearly been developing exceptional expertise while working here. I'm curious why this is the first time I'm seeing your strategic work. The question hung in the air, loaded with implications. I could have offered diplomatic explanations about team collaboration and supporting roles, but something about his direct manner encouraged honesty. I've been trying to share these insights for 5 years, I said quietly. Today was the first time anyone asked to see them. He nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. Well, that changes now. I'll be very interested to see what you develop over the next 2 weeks. As he walked away, I realized that everything had shifted. The invisible years were over. Now came the real challenge, proving that this recognition was deserved and that I could deliver on the opportunity I'd been given. The corner desk suddenly felt very far away. 2 weeks later, I stood in the lobby of the Meridian Global Tower in Manhattan, clutching my presentation materials and trying to calm my nerves. The 47th floor conference room would soon host marketing executives from 17 countries, all gathered to discuss the future direction of our international campaigns. My presentation had evolved far beyond what I'd originally envisioned. Working 12-hour days, I'd developed not just a framework for influence-based marketing, but a complete methodology that included implementation guidelines, measurement protocols, and case studies spanning multiple industries. I'd tested elements of my approach with 3 willing clients from my regular research assignments, and the results had exceeded even my own expectations. The elevator ride to the 47th floor felt eternal. Sarah and Marcus were traveling up with me, both having been included in the summit at the last minute. The dynamic between us had shifted dramatically since Robert Chen's visit to Chicago. Where once they'd barely acknowledged my existence, now they were carefully polite, uncertain how to navigate my sudden elevation in status. "Remember," Sarah said as we reached our floor, "this is a sophisticated international audience. Keep your presentation focused on the strategic overview rather than getting lost in technical details." Her tone was meant to be helpful, but I detected the familiar undertone of doubt. Even now, with my work validated by the CEO himself, she seemed to question whether I could handle this level of responsibility. The conference room was spectacular, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering panoramic views of Central Park and the Manhattan skyline. Around the curved conference table sat some of the most influential marketing professionals in the industry. I recognized several faces from business magazines and industry publications, people whose strategic decisions affected global brand campaigns worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Robert Chen stood at the head of the room, welcoming attendees and outlining the day's agenda. When he introduced me, I felt a surge of pride mixed with terror. "Today's final presentation comes from Claire Morrison in our Chicago office," he announced. "Claire has developed an innovative approach to consumer engagement that I believe represents the future of strategic marketing. Her insights have the potential to transform how we understand and reach evolving consumer markets." As I walked to the presentation area, I caught glimpses of curious faces around the table. Some looked genuinely interested, others appeared politely skeptical. A few seemed to be wondering who I was and why I was addressing such a senior audience. I began with a question that had been bothering me for months. How many of our most successful campaigns from the past year actually worked for the reasons we think they did? The room grew quiet. This wasn't the typical opening for a corporate presentation, and I could sense people recalibrating their expectations. "I've been analyzing our most celebrated campaigns across all markets," I continued, pulling up my first slide. "What I discovered is that in almost every case, our success came from accidentally engaging influence networks rather than from our intended demographic targeting strategies." I showed them side-by-side comparisons of planned campaign strategies versus what had actually driven engagement. The disconnect was striking. Time after time, campaigns had succeeded when they'd inadvertently reached specific micro-communities that then amplified the message through network effects. "We've been taking credit for understanding our audiences when we've actually been succeeding despite our targeting strategies," I explained. "But what if we could intentionally harness these influence patterns?" The next 30 minutes unfolded like a strategic revelation. I walked them through my framework for identifying influence nodes, showed them the mathematical models I'd developed for predicting network spread, and demonstrated how this approach could be implemented across different cultural contexts and market conditions. But the real breakthrough came when I presented my case studies. 3 months earlier, I'd convinced 3 mid-level clients to let me test elements of my framework on small-scale campaigns. The results spoke for themselves. 300% improvement in engagement rates, 70% reduction in cost per conversion, and most importantly, sustained community building that continued generating value long after the initial campaign ended. "These aren't theoretical projections," I emphasized. "These are actual results from real campaigns, achieved by shifting from demographic targeting to influence node engagement." Dr. Elena Vasquez, Director of European Operations, raised her hand. "Claire, this is impressive work. But how do we scale this approach across different cultural contexts? Influence patterns vary significantly between markets." this was exactly the kind of sophisticated question I'd hoped for. "You're absolutely right about cultural variation," I responded. "But that's actually where this framework becomes most powerful. Instead of imposing standardized demographic categories across cultures, we identify the organic influence networks that already exist within each market context." I showed them a comparative analysis I'd done of influence patterns in 6 different countries. While the specific communities varied dramatically, the underlying network structures followed surprisingly consistent mathematical patterns. My framework could be adapted to any cultural context while maintaining its effectiveness. The questions came rapidly after that. How long did it take to map influence networks? Could this approach work for B2B campaigns? What about privacy concerns with the data collection required? I'd anticipated most of these challenges and had developed thoughtful responses backed by concrete research. But the moment that changed everything came when James Morrison, head of Asia-Pacific operations, no relation, despite sharing my last name, asked about implementation timeline. "If we wanted to pilot this approach across our international markets," he said, "what kind of support structure would we need?" Before I could respond, Robert Chen spoke up. "I've been thinking about that question since Claire's presentation in Chicago," he said. "This framework represents a fundamental shift in how we approach strategic marketing. Implementing it effectively will require dedicated leadership and careful coordination across all our global operations." He paused, looking directly at me. "Claire, I'd like you to consider leading the global implementation of this methodology. We're talking about creating a new strategic position that would involve working with our teams across 17 countries to transform how we approach client campaigns." The silence in the room was profound. I could feel Sarah and Marcus both staring at me from across the table, their expressions unreadable. Around the conference table, senior executives were processing what they'd just heard. I was being offered the kind of position that represented the pinnacle of strategic marketing careers. "This would be based here in New York," Robert continued, "reporting directly to the international leadership team. You'd be responsible for training our global staff, developing customized implementations for different markets, and serving as our primary strategic consultant for high-value client relationships." My mind was racing. This wasn't just recognition for my work. It was an opportunity to reshape how an entire industry approached consumer engagement. But it also meant leaving Chicago, leaving the familiar environment where I'd spent 5 years fighting for recognition. "I'm honored by the offer," I said, my voice somehow remaining steady despite my racing heart. "This framework represents years of research and development, and the opportunity to implement it on a global scale is exactly what I'd hoped for when I first began this work." "Is that a yes?" Robert asked with a slight smile. I looked around the room at faces that were now focused on me with genuine respect and anticipation. These were people who controlled strategic decisions for some of the world's largest brands, and they were waiting to hear whether I would accept a position that would make me their peer. "Yes," I said. "Absolutely yes." The applause that followed felt surreal. For 5 years, I'd been invisible, my ideas dismissed or appropriated by others. Now I was being celebrated by industry leaders for the same strategic thinking that had been ignored for so long. As the summit concluded and people began networking over cocktails, I found myself surrounded by executives eager to discuss implementation strategies and collaboration opportunities. Dr. Vasquez mentioned several European clients who would be perfect for pilot programs. James Morrison talked about the unique challenges and opportunities in Asian markets. Everyone seemed genuinely excited about the possibilities my framework represented. Later that evening, as I stood at the window of my hotel room looking out at the glittering Manhattan skyline, I reflected on the incredible journey that had brought me to this moment. Tomorrow, I would return to Chicago to begin the transition process. Within a month, I'd be back in New York, leading a team of strategic consultants and working with clients whose budgets exceeded the annual revenue of entire companies. But more than the career advancement, what struck me was the validation of something I'd always believed but had begun to doubt: that good work eventually finds its way to the right audience. It had taken 5 years, countless ignored presentations, and more professional disappointments than I could count. But persistence had finally paid off. My phone buzzed with a text from Robert Chen. "Congratulations on an outstanding presentation. Looking forward to working with you to transform how our industry thinks about consumer engagement." I typed back a simple response. "Thank you for seeing what others missed." As I prepared for bed, I thought about all the nights I'd stayed late in that corner office, convinced that no one noticed or valued my contributions. Tomorrow, I would begin a new chapter where my expertise would be recognized, developed, and implemented on a scale I'd never imagined possible. The invisible years were truly over. The global stage awaited.